I am Dr. Roger Libby, and I'm here today to talk about a concept called sex addiction and porn addiction, which don't exist. They don't exist at all from all the research we have, and they don't exist from conceptual clarity or any theoretical framework that makes any sense. A bunch of moralists created this concept, Dr. Patrick Carnes, back in the 80s, and it stuck with the media. The media is very sensational, and they like to think that there's such a thing as a porn addict and a sex addict. The truth is, it's just an excuse for people who seem to get carried away a little bit with their sexuality so they can say, well, I couldn't help it, I'm an addict. And it's all just bull, total bull. And there's, inpatient clinics where Tiger Woods and others have gone and spent $40,000 a month just to be helped because they were a sex addict. And they wasted their money. The problem is the same 12-step approach that is used for alcoholism and drug addiction is used by sex addiction counselors and by these inpatient clinics. So what I know is that you cannot get an internal locus of control to solve a person's problem of being out of balance or obsessive compulsive unless you take a more reasonable approach like cognitive behavioral therapy to change their thoughts and their behavior, which is what I do. I mean, there are people who are out of balance with their sexual behavior. They're obsessive, they're not doing a good job with their family life or with their work, and it's because they often had a repressed background from rigid religion, which is the arch enemy of sex, and their parents didn't discuss sex, so they thought there was something wrong with it, so they were ashamed about masturbation, etc. And then they grow into adulthood and they still think that sex is something to be controlled or repressed. The truth is, sex is something to be enjoyed, and we have to do it with some common sense. But sex addiction is not a reasonable concept, and the diagnostic and statistical manual that therapists use to diagnose problems did not include sex addiction or hypersexuality in the recent edition, the DSM-5, because there was no empirical justification for it. And sex addiction counselors now say, oh, well, it'll be included in the next edition, or we're still believe in what we're doing. And well, they're motivated by money. That's why they believe in what they're doing. And a lot of them really do believe that they themselves are recovering sex addicts. Some of the sex counselors, in fact, sex addiction therapists, are often recovered sex addicts or porn addicts. And so they're in recovery, which means they're somehow now they're all balanced and happy, and sex is just a part of their life. And, none of it makes any sense. So I approach this that, first of all, most pornography is kind of uninteresting. There's no script to make it erotic. I mean, it becomes like open heart surgery after a while, a penis and a vagina getting together. I mean, who are these people? What does it mean? I like to see a script to make it erotic instead of just, giving an okay to incestuous behavior or mixing violence and sex and all the taboo behaviors, some of which are not healthy, that you see in porn. But porn itself is a paper tiger. It doesn't make people go out and rape or anything like that. In fact, the research shows quite the opposite, that when you expose people to explicit sex, they're less likely to be violent or whatever. Back in the 80s, I conducted a national and international study, a cross-cultural study with 5 cultures, including the United States and Sweden. And I did it with Dr. Murray Strauss at the University of New Hampshire Family Violence Program, and that's where I got my postdoctoral fellowship. And what we found was that there was an inverse relationship between sex and violence. That is, the more you try to repress sex, the more you get frustration, aggression, and violence. So that would be one reason why Sweden is more sexual and less violent compared to our country. Because violence is winked at here, whereas sex is repressed even though it's sensationalized in the media. So it's kind of a dangerous Molotov cocktail, the way we look at sex in this culture. And I think it's time for us to be more balanced and to realize sex is a good thing, and we ought to have it more, and we ought to enjoy it more and not take it quite so seriously. Well, the whole sex addiction approach and porn addiction approach is taking sex extremely seriously. People who call themselves sex addiction counselors are certified supposedly by IITP or SOSH, the Society for the Advancement of the Study of the advancement of sexual health, rather. And it's not sexual health. It's a misnamed society. I believe we need to call a spade, and people who are really into the sex addiction stuff ought to re-examine themselves, because what they're doing is destructive and harmful to clients. What I have found is that most of the sex addiction counselors that are out there today are spewing out stuff from their own experience because they believe they are recovered sex addicts. In fact, some of the key people in the whole national movement with sex addiction claim they are recovered sex addicts, and now they're going to help somebody else. They're putting the focus on sex when it's really anxiety, loneliness, fear, shame, and often sexual abuse that makes them out of balance, so that they tend to become obsessive compulsive about sex. But it's not sex. Usually when you're obsessive compulsive, you're obsessive compulsive about more than one thing, like dirt, everything being in its place. It's not just sex. And so I think that sex takes a bad rap here, and it shouldn't. I believe that we need to take a more reasonable approach. Now, people who have affairs, some people are going to have affairs. I think they ought to have some agreement in their marriage, either don't ask, don't tell, or share everything, or let's be swingers or something. But people do have affairs, and so when they do, they come to me and they say, well, my husband's a sex addict. He had an affair. He started with porn, and then he went down the slippery slope. And so I look for the slippery slope, but I don't find it. Basically, all we know is that this guy is out of balance, partly because he's not having a good sex life with his wife. So my job is to improve their sex life so that he doesn't go out and do things he shouldn't do. A sex addiction counselor doesn't have the skills or the training to help them with their own sex life, because they're not sex therapists like me. All they do is shame them and tell them, you're an addict, and now you're going to go through a 12-step program, and then you won't be an addict. Well, the research shows that addiction, including sex addiction, is not a disease. There's some recent research at the UCLA by Nicole Prouse, Dr. Prouse, where she has found that addiction is not a disease, and she's done a lot of the brain research and everything to show that it's not like a big brain problem that's called sex addiction. And similarly, Josh Grubbs is a researcher who's done research on the role of religion in identifying who is a porn addict. Most of the porn addicts, self-described, or sex addicts, tend to have a repressive religious background. They are themselves religious, and they've been kind of indoctrinated with all this stuff, so then they conclude, I'm an addict, and that gives them an excuse to say, oh, well, I couldn't help myself. I think a final point I would like to make about the sex and porn addiction area is that the media are starting to get smart. They're starting to realize that they've sensationalized for too long about something that doesn't exist. And so Rolling Stone, for example, is now doing a big feature article on this Make Love Not Porn website, which claims all this porn and sex addiction is this big threat to America. And so Rolling Stone is just one example. I think we're going to see other media outlets that are going to start to expose the sex addict culture as something that's never had a solid basis.